On NBC's Meet the Press. I want to read you a quote from him, spoken just a short time ago. "I have no doubt that he and his organization played a significant role in this." Mr. Cheney referring to the Saudi terrorist Osama bin Laden. He also went on to say, echoing the president's words yesterday, that Mr. bin Laden and his organization are the prime suspects here. And again, as the administration tries to prepare the American people for a sustained campaign, a military campaign, but also a financial and diplomatic campaign, the vice president said the war on terrorism could take years. Now, for more on this, I want to bring in my colleague Kelly Wallace, who's been tracking the president and the debate of the national security team this weekend up at the presidential retreat of Camp David. Kelly, as the president debates his military options, he also has a significant challenge trying to calm the jitters of the American public, does he not?
Absolutely, John. That is a very big challenge for the president. And the way he's going to handle that, as you know, White House officials say, is to take every chance he can to do a couple of things, give a couple of messages to the American people. One, letting the American people know that this campaign against terrorism, this military, political, and economic campaign against terrorism will not be an overnight solution, that it will take time and that it won't be easy. At the same time, though, John, he is urging the American people to get back to work, to go to their jobs on Monday. He is saying he's hoping, of course, the American economy will continue to go on. Some reassuring signals will come when Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill rings the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange tomorrow. Mr. Bush also noting yesterday when he talked to reporters, Major League Baseball about to begin on Monday. The president saying, John, then that it is important for America to get on about its life, but by no means will it be business as usual. The president will continue, of course, to use the bully pulpit to remember those who lost their lives in the tragedies in New York, Pennsylvania, and in Virginia, and of course to console those who are still have their loved ones missing. And at the same time, he's telling the American people that the administration will continue to take every step, every possible measure it can to protect the American people. So that might mean it might take a little bit longer to board flights because of security measures. So again, not business as usual, but the president trying to tell people to start going on with their lives, but at the same time remembering, of course, this deep, deep tragedy. John?
All right, Kelly Wallace up at Camp David, thank you. I want to continue this conversation now with Jay Carney, White House correspondent for Time Magazine. This an event that transformed the nation, certainly transformed the Bush presidency as well. I want to share with us your reporting. The president is flying back to Washington. He's aboard Air Force One on Tuesday. At the time, the government thinks there could still be potentially 2 or 3 or 4 more potential hijacks out there, and they come to the president and he has to make a very difficult decision, doesn't he?
John, George W. Bush had to make a decision in this, his 8th month as president, that few presidents would ever have to make, and it was so daunting, it gives you chills. In a conversation with Dick Cheney, the vice president, with whom he was speaking every 30 minutes from Air Force One, they had to decide if, in fact, there was another plane out there that had been hijacked, would they authorize U.S. military jets to shoot it down? So the president had to decide whether he would take lives in order to save lives, take American lives, potentially, in order to save lives. And he and Dick Cheney decided they would. As a last resort, they gave the order. If a plane did not respond, did not divert from its apparent target, shoot it down.
This is a president who came to office with a domestic agenda of cutting taxes, also a moral agenda, if you will, restoring decency and civility to Washington. Yet he himself said the other day, the American people need to understand this. This, meaning the war on terrorism, is now the singular mission, the fundamental mission of my presidency. How did we see a transformation of the president himself this past week?
Well, it was a slow development. I would say that those first 48 hours for the president, that he was not his best self. I mean, he was certainly better, I think, Thursday and Friday. He had, I was actually on Air Force One in the pool on that first day, and at the Air Force Base in Barksdale, I think he was a little tentative, a little shaky. And then as the days progressed, I think he found his voice. And I really think the moment might have been right after he made that public phone call to Governor Pataki in New York and Mayor Giuliani, which I think was kind of awkward and poorly staged. And it seemed to, I think, those of us who watched it, that the president was sort of trying to share in a little of Giuliani's reflected heroism because everyone's been praising him so much. The moment he got off that phone call, he took some questions from reporters, and we saw a president who was not scripted, extremely emotional, who was talking about leading everyone towards victory in this war against terrorism, and then got a little teary talking about the families of the victims of this tragedy. So I really think that was a transition point for him, because then on Friday I think he gave an excellent speech at the National Cathedral, and I think his very impromptu and brief remarks on the rubble at the site of the World Trade Center were very powerful and effective.
A great deal of confusion, obviously, in those early hours. One of the debates brewing in Washington, some White House officials have suggested that plane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh could have potentially been targeting Air Force One, yet in its own briefings to key members of Congress, we're told the administration identified Camp David, the Capitol, or the White House as the potential targets for that plane. This confusion, this exaggeration on the White House part?
I think they were extremely sensitive to criticism that the president did not return to Washington quickly enough. There was that period Tuesday afternoon where not only Democrats but Republicans were saying privately, where's the president? Why is he? Nobody knew where we were or where the president was as he was flying around until he got to different places. And in response to criticism, in particular William Safire's column in the New York Times, I think they took it a step too far. Clearly the White House was a perceived target and a potential target, very dangerous. They had to evacuate it. The plane hit the Pentagon. I don't think anybody would suggest that it wasn't right to assume that the White House was a target, and law enforcement agencies say that they felt it was. But to say that Air Force One was a target, our reporting with law enforcement agencies suggests that at the very least it's an exaggeration. Air Force One, in fact, we were being told on Tuesday and Wednesday by people who were trying to defend the Bush administration and their decisions that one of the reasons why the president stayed aloft was because Air Force One was one of the safest places he could be, not a dangerous place to be. So I think they were defensive, and they probably spun that one a little too far.
All right, Jay Carney of Time Magazine, thank you very much. You can read Jay's reporting on this trying week for the president in the latest issue of Time, the upcoming issue, of Time Magazine, which on the cover shows a picture of President Bush standing amid those relief workers in New York City, speaking through a bullhorn just the other day. Now for more, we go back to Paula Zahn in New York.
Thanks, John. In a lot of places of worship across the country today, there is much reflection about the terror of what this country has been exposed to. We take you now to the Salem Baptist Church in Omaha, Nebraska, for a sense of how people are dealing with this terrible tragedy that has struck our country.
Has he been good to anybody this morning? High five somebody and say, he's been good to me. God has been so.
Obviously, this congregation trying to focus in on the combined strength of its parishioners and any sense of hope people can find during this extremely disturbing time of our country's history. If you were with us earlier this morning, you might have heard some of the questions some of you posed to our panel, many of them dealing with Osama bin Laden, who not only has Secretary of State Colin Powell declared as a prime suspect, even President Bush declared as a prime suspect yesterday. Mike Boettcher now gives us an extensive look at who Osama bin Laden is, where he gets his money, and what he intends to accomplish.
It came without warning. A catastrophic attack on the World Trade Center.
Had him back.
Less than an hour later, another terrorist strike at the heart of U.S. military might.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
Swirling amid the clouds of smoke billowing from these symbols of power, the terrible question: who could be behind such a devastating act of terrorism? The evidence is still being examined. One name tops the list of suspects. It's a name that's been on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for years: Osama bin Laden.
His organization has both the suicide bombers willing to die in these kinds of attacks. It also has the pilots. It's had a history of training pilots. And also it has basically the level of kind of sophistication and coordination to bring off something like this.
The 44-year-old bin Laden, through a spokesman, denies any involvement. But according to a Palestinian journalist, he congratulated those who carried out the deadly attacks. The ruling Taliban government of Afghanistan, the country where bin Laden is believed to be in hiding, says the Islamic extremists could not be responsible. In Western intelligence circles, bin Laden has been well known for years for this document, a call for jihad, or holy war, against the thousands of U.S. soldiers now stationed in Saudi Arabia. That call to jihad came after 2 bombings of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. The first in Riyadh in 1995, 7 dead. The second in Dhahran in 1996, 19 dead, hundreds injured. Bin Laden discussed that call to arms in his first ever television interview with CNN in 1997.
We declared a jihad, a holy war against the United States government because it's unjust, criminal, and tyrannical.
Bin Laden wants U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia. He opposes U.S. bombing campaigns in Iraq. He is against U.S. support of Israel. And he objects to U.S. backing of Arab nations he deems un-Islamic, such as Egypt. Bin Laden has been indicted as the mastermind behind the bombings of 2 U.S. embassies in Africa that killed 224 people in 1998. He is a prime suspect in the bombing of the USS Cole last October. That blast killed 17 U.S. sailors. And the U.S. State Department has linked him to the first attack on the World Trade Center in February of 1993. 6 people were killed and thousands injured.
The man is ruthless, and he believes that he should declare war against the United States. And this kind of appeal, this kind of call actually appealed to many young Muslims all over the world.
A videotape circulating around the Middle East and on the internet surfaced just 3 months ago. It shows bin Laden training young militants, some who seem as young as 11, for his holy war. Bin Laden makes an impassioned plea for recruits in the 2-hour tape. The videotape also hints that bin Laden is planning additional anti-American operations.
One thing that bin Laden does before a big attack happens is that he subtly indicates several months before or a couple of months before that something's in the works.
The man codenamed the Contractor has used his enormous wealth to advance those militant plans. He was born the son of a multimillionaire Saudi construction magnate. He's the 17th of 52 children, some of whom live in the United States. His father died when he was 10. The family construction business, the largest in Saudi Arabia, is now worth an estimated $5 billion. Osama bin Laden's first marriage was to a Syrian cousin at the age of 17.
His education took place at quite a good university in Saudi Arabia, where he studied public administration, economics. He'd also already participated a little bit in the family business. From a young age, he was involved in the family business. This is not an unsophisticated guy. This is somebody who comes from one of the most well-connected families in Saudi Arabia, one of the richest.
He would later draw on the resources of his family business and his experience as a demolitions expert. After the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, his life would take a radical turn. Bin Laden has been in Afghanistan on and off since the 1980s, when he joined the Afghan resistance in its war against the Soviet Union. At 23 years of age and deeply religious, Osama bin Laden left his comfortable life in Saudi Arabia to fight alongside thousands of volunteers from the Islamic world. He used his family wealth, construction equipment, and demolition expertise to help in the crusade, and he would become a leader of the so-called Afghan Arabs.
Because of that, a lot of people wanted to participate in jihad, and they thought that Osama is an important figure. but he was not only willing to put his money, but he actually gone there himself and fought himself and get hurt.
The Afghan war changed bin Laden. He saw a lightly armed guerrilla force defeat a superpower.
In this jihad, the biggest benefit was the